Welcome back to our journey through the Book of Jasher. In our last episode, we saw the seeds of oppression being sown. Now we witness how time hardened Egypt, and what fear began, power perfected. The Book of Jasher offers a stark, unflinching look at this period. It records that the suffering of the children of Israel intensified, not simply because Pharaoh lacked compassion, but because authority, by its very nature, resists anything it cannot control. Israel represented a variable, a people whose loyalties and destiny were not tied to Egypt, but to a God that Pharaoh did not acknowledge. This made them unpredictable, and in the eyes of a ruler obsessed with order, unpredictability is a threat. So Israel cried out. As their pleas for relief rose, their labor increased. The Egyptians, driven by a mixture of fear and command, piled on more work. Hope, once a steady flame, began to thin. It flickered against the harsh winds of daily affliction. And through it all, heaven still seemed silent. Imagine the crushing weight of that silence. Years turned into decades. Generations were born into chains, knowing no memory of freedom, only the promise whispered by fathers who themselves had never seen it fulfilled. They inherited a legacy of bondage, a reality etched into their very bones. Jasher emphasizes this silence for a critical reason, because silence tests faith far more profoundly than suffering. Suffering can be endured, it can be resisted. It can even forge a sense of identity and community. But silence from God, that can feel like abandonment. It gnaws at the very foundation of belief. It tempts the soul to believe that its cries are unheard, its pain unseen, its God absent. While Israel grappled with this divine quiet, Pharaoh's heart hardened. The Book of Jasher presents this not as a sudden event, but as a progressive petrification of the soul. Power insulated him from the suffering of others. The prosperity of his kingdom deafened him to the cries of the enslaved, and a deep-seated fear, a paranoia that his empire was fragile, convinced him that cruelty was not just an option but a necessary tool for survival. He saw Israel's growth not as a blessing, but as a demographic time bomb ticking at the heart of his nation. So the Egyptians tightened their control. Workloads that were already unbearable were increased yet again. Lives worn down by relentless labor and despair shortened. Yet in a paradox that defied all of Egypt's logic, Israel continued to multiply. The more they were afflicted, the more they grew. This demographic miracle was a direct affront to Pharaoh's authority. His policies of oppression had become counterproductive. The very measures he took to weaken Israel were, in some mysterious way, strengthening their numbers. This defiance of logic pushed Pharaoh's fear toward a new, terrifying conclusion: annihilation. Jasher records Pharaoh's growing obsession. Israel was no longer just a labor force to be managed. They were an existential threat to national security. The narrative in his mind shifted from control to elimination, and so cruelty escalated from a tool of policy to a daily practice. Beatings became routine, a part of the landscape. Showing any mercy was reframed as a weakness, a betrayal of the state. The air itself seemed thick with the cries of the Hebrews, a constant, sorrowful sound that filled the land of Egypt from Goshen to the royal court. And then, after generations of this mounting despair, something changed. The suffering reached a critical mass. The divine silence, so long and profound, was about to be broken. The Book of Jasher tells us that God heard. This is a pivotal moment. It wasn't because the suffering was new, it had been going on for a very long time. It was because the appointed time had finally arrived. Every moment of pain, every tear, every unanswered prayer had been measured. The great clock of divine providence had ticked to its designated hour. The covenant God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob remembered its promise. The cries of Israel, which had for so long seemed to dissipate into an empty sky, now rose like a thick column of incense, a memorial before the throne of heaven. And far away from the brutal reality of Egypt's brick pits, in the quiet wilderness of Midian, a shepherd, a former prince of Egypt, tended his father-in-law's sheep. He was a man living in obscurity, unaware that the silence was about to end and that heaven was preparing to speak his name. In the next part of our episode, we will leave the darkness and despair of Egypt and return to this man, Moses. We will journey with him into the desert, where a fire waits in a bush, and the silence of centuries is about to be shattered by the voice of God. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. Let's continue our journey into the Book of Jasher. The wilderness was quiet. For years, Moses had learned its rhythms, a stark contrast to the opulence of Pharaoh's court and the clang of a slave's chains. His days passed with the simple sounds of wind and the gentle movement of sheep. There was no throne to claim, no urgency to escape. There was only obscurity, a vast and humbling emptiness. It was here, far from the ambitions of Egypt and the sting of his past failures, that the Book of Jasher tells us God chose to speak. It began with fire, a bush common and unremarkable, suddenly ablaze in the stark landscape. But this was no ordinary fire. The flames danced and flickered, yet the leaves and branches were not consumed. The bush burned, but it endured. Jasher highlights this moment as a test of attention. The sight was strange, an anomaly in the predictable desert. Moses, his curiosity piqued, turned aside from his flock to investigate. That decision, that simple act of turning, mattered profoundly. The book emphasizes a powerful truth here. Divine revelation doesn't always interrupt our lives with a thunderous crash. Often, it waits patiently for our attention. God did not force Moses closer. The choice was his. As Moses drew near, a voice called his name from the heart of the flame. Moses. And Moses, startled but present, answered, "Here I am." But all was quickly followed by fear. The voice declared the very ground he stood on to be holy. He was commanded to remove his sandals, a gesture of humility and reverence. In that moment Moses stood exposed, not to the heat of the flame, but to the weight of a divine calling. His identity was stripped bare. He was no longer a prince of Egypt, nor simply a shepherd in Midian. He was a man standing before his Creator. Then God spoke of promises made long ago, of a covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. He spoke of the suffering of his people in Egypt, their cries that had reached the heavens. God declared that the time for deliverance had finally come, and Moses was to be his instrument. But Moses resisted. The Book of Jasher records his hesitation not as a sign of rebellion, but with a deep sense of compassion. Moses didn't doubt God's power to save Israel. He doubted himself. Decades of failure, of being a fugitive and an outsider, had carved deep insecurities into his soul. The confidence he once possessed as a prince had long since evaporated in the desert sun. His first question echoed the cry of so many who feel inadequate. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? It was a question born of a broken spirit. God's response wasn't a list of Moses' qualifications or a pep talk to boost his ego. The answer was simple, yet it was everything. I will be with you. The assurance was not in Moses' ability, but in God's presence. To bolster this promise, signs were given. The shepherd's staff in his hand was thrown to the ground and became a serpent. When he picked it up, it was a staff once more. His hand, placed inside his cloak, came out afflicted with leprosy, white as snow. When he returned it, it was healed. He was told that even the water of the Nile would turn to blood at his command. These were not mere tricks. They were demonstrations of a power that could suspend and transform the very laws of nature. Yet even with these incredible signs, Moses hesitated. His fear was loud. He protested that he was slow of speech, not a man of eloquent words. He was looking for any reason to escape this terrifying responsibility. And here, the narrative in Jasher reveals the incredible patience of God. Instead of dismissing Moses for his reluctance, God provided a solution. His brother Aaron, who was known to be a gifted speaker, would be his voice. The burden would be shared, but the calling itself remained firm. Jasher shows us something absolutely crucial in this exchange. God does not demand our confidence. He demands our obedience. Reluctance does not disqualify us when reverence remains. Moses' fear did not negate his faithfulness. His self-doubt did not cancel God's choice. And so, with Aaron by his side and a divine promise in his heart, Moses made the journey back. He returned to Egypt, the land he had fled in shame so many years before. He returned not as a prince seeking a throne, nor as a fugitive hiding from justice, but as a humble servant, an ambassador for the God of his fathers. His return sets the stage for a monumental clash. In the next part of our story, we will witness the first direct confrontation between the will of heaven and the power of an earthly throne. God's name will be spoken before Pharaoh for the first time, and the world will watch as resistance hardens into judgment, and the plagues of Egypt begin. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part of this incredible story from the Book of Jasher. As we continue our journey through the Book of Jasher, we arrive at the heart of an ancient empire. Egypt awaited, a civilization draped in gold and power, its foundations built on the backs of slaves. Pharaoh sat on his throne, untroubled by centuries of divine warning. To him, the cries of the Israelites were faint echoes, easily ignored, until their inconvenience demanded attention. But that was about to change. Into this grand court, filled with the arrogance of human authority, walked two men, Moses and Aaron. It was God's messenger confronting the most powerful man on earth. It was divine authority meeting human. The Book of Jasher masterfully paints the tension of this moment. It wasn't just two men standing before a king. Purpose. It was unwavering will meeting stubborn disobedience. This was a showdown not of armies, but of hearts. Moses and Aaron delivered their message, a simple yet profound command from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Let my people go. How did Pharaoh respond? Not with polite curiosity, not with a thoughtful inquiry. He responded with a heart as hard as the stones of his pyramids. The Book of Jasher records the exchange word for word, preserving the chilling dismissal. God's name was declared. The long history of Israel's suffering was recounted. A hand of mercy was offered, a chance to yield without consequence. All of it was dismissed with contempt. Pharaoh, in his pride, looked at these two men and saw only shepherds, not ambassadors of the Almighty. He didn't just say no. He scoffed at the very idea that a higher power could command him. And so the first sign came. The staff was thrown down, and a miracle occurred. But Pharaoh's court was filled with its own brand of magic. His sorcerers, Jans, and Jambers replicated the sign, hardening the king's heart further. He believed their trickery was a match for divine power. This initial defiance set the stage for a conflict that would shake Egypt to its core. The first confrontation was over, but the war for Israel's freedom had just begun. With Pharaoh's heart sealed in defiance, God's power was unleashed, not for destruction alone, but for revelation. The first plague was a poetic and terrifying strike at the very soul of Egypt. The Nile, the great river they worshipped as a god, their source of life, fertility, and prosperity, became the first herald of divine judgment. Aaron stretched out his staff, and the waters throughout the land turned to blood. The river stank, the fish died, and the Egyptians could not drink from their once sacred source. Imagine the panic. The lifeblood of their nation had become a river of death. Pharaoh's magicians, in a desperate attempt to maintain control, managed to replicate the effect on a small scale. But they couldn't reverse it. They could mimic the curse, but they couldn't provide the cure. This was a crucial detail Jasher highlights. Man's magic could imitate destruction, but it was powerless to bring restoration. The people trembled, digging for fresh water, their daily lives thrown into chaos. Yet, in the palace, Pharaoh's heart remained stubborn. He saw the sign, but refused to see the sender. Then the plagues followed, one after another, in a relentless, escalating sequence. Frogs swarmed from the bloody river, covering every inch of the land, invading their homes, their beds, their ovens. Then came the lice, a torment on man and beast, a plague the magicians couldn't replicate, forcing them to admit, "This is the finger of God." But still, Pharaoh refused. Swarms of flies descended, then a devastating pestilence that struck down Egypt's livestock while sparing Israel's. Painful boils afflicted the Egyptians, followed by a storm of fire and hail so severe it shattered trees and destroyed crops. Then came the locusts, a crawling, devouring blanket that consumed everything the hail had left behind. Finally, a suffocating darkness fell over Egypt for 3 days, a darkness so thick it could be felt. The Book of Jasher lingers on the details of this suffering, not for spectacle, but to illustrate a profound truth, the direct and devastating consequence of defying God. Each plague was a precise demonstration of power, a patient call to repentance, and a purposeful step toward liberation. With each plague, a strange and tragic thing happened to Pharaoh's heart. It hardened. You might think it hardened because he became crueler, but Jasher suggests something more complex. It hardened because his fear twisted into pride. The more undeniable God's power became, the more fiercely he resisted it. His magicians had failed. His gods were silent. His nation was crumbling. But admitting defeat meant bowing his knee, and his pride would not allow it. He would negotiate, he would bargain, he would lie and break his promises, but he would not submit. This cycle of devastation, temporary repentance, and renewed stubbornness repeated itself 9 times, each one leaving Egypt more broken and Pharaoh more resolute in his rebellion. And what of Israel? Jasher shows us that while Egypt suffered, Israel watched. They were protected in their homes in Goshen, miraculously spared from the plagues that ravaged their neighbors. But this wasn't a simple spectator sport. Their emotions were a complex mix of fear and hope. They saw deliverance on the horizon, a promise finally coming to pass. Yet the chains of bondage still gripped their lives. The overseer's whip still cracked. They were still slaves. This gradual unfolding of God's plan wasn't just for Pharaoh's sake. It was for Israel's too. It was a lesson in patience, a masterclass in trust, and a powerful demonstration that their deliverance would come not from their own strength, but from God's hand alone. They were learning to rely on a power far greater than Pharaoh's. After the oppressive darkness lifted, the final, most terrifying plague approached. This was the point of no return. God's message to Pharaoh was chillingly clear. One more plague, and it would strike the heart of every Egyptian family, the death of the firstborn. The Book of Jasher does not shy away from the profound sorrow of this moment. It describes a nation preparing for a night of unprecedented grief. There was a great cry throughout Egypt, as families from the palace to the dungeon lost their firstborn sons. But for Israel, this night was different. It was a night of obedience, ritual, and salvation. They were given specific instructions. Take an unblemished lamb, sacrifice it, and paint its blood upon the doorposts of your homes. They were to roast the lamb and eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, dressed and ready to leave at a moment's notice. This was the first Passover. As the angel of death swept through the land of Egypt, it saw the blood and passed over the Israelites. Obedience was their shield. And so God passed over. The great and terrible night came to an end. The screams from Egyptian homes pierced the dome, while the homes of the Hebrews remained untouched. The judgment that shattered an empire became the salvation of a people. Pharaoh, his own firstborn son, now dead, finally broke. He and his people didn't just let the Israelites go. They urged them to leave, pressing gold, silver, and clothing upon them, desperate to be rid of them. The stage was now set. The long night of slavery was over. Egypt lay shattered by its own stubborn pride and the weight of divine judgment. Israel, after 430 years of bondage, was finally freed from its chains. The Book of Jasher closes this monumental episode with a powerful reminder. It shows us that obedience preserves life, that divine timing is perfect, and that God's faithfulness to His promises never, ever fails, even when human hearts resist until their final breaking point. The journey was far from over, but the first and most difficult step had been taken. In our next episode, the story continues with one of the most incredible events in all of human history. We will follow the mass exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, the dramatic pursuit by Pharaoh's army, and the parting of the Red Sea. We'll witness the birth of a nation under the covenant, as God leads His people from slavery into their destiny. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.